The Quran is the holy book for Muslims, and throughout the Islamic world, the book is held in high regard, not just due to the origin of the Quran in Islamic theology, but also for some surprising things that are mentioned in the Quran. So we're starting at number 10. Let's look at the origin of life. Now, water is essential for all living things. And we all know that water is a basic need for life, but in the Quran, there's a very surprising claim in it. We made every living thing from water. Will they not believe? And that's found in the Quran, Surah 21, verses 30. So this verse, we see that water is pointed out as the origin of life. All living things are made up of cells, and we now know that cells are mostly made up of water. For example, 80% of cytoplasm, which are the basic cell materials of a standard animal cell, is described as water in biology textbooks. Now, the fact that living things consist mostly of water was discovered only after the invention of the microscope. In the deserts of Arabia, the last thing somebody would have guessed is that life came from water. There's also a surprising claim at number 9 about iron. So iron apparently is unnatural to Earth, and it did not form on the Earth but actually came down from outer space. This is according to many scientists who believe that billions of years ago the Earth was actually struck by meteorites, and now these meteorites were actually carrying iron from distant stars that had exploded, and they landed into Earth, and then we had iron. Now in the Quran, it has this to say about iron. We sent down iron with its great inherent strength and its many benefits for humankind. And you can find that in the Quran, Surah 57, verses 25. So the Quran uses the word sent down for iron. So this verse points that iron is not an earthly material, but was sent down for the benefit of humankind. Now the fact that iron came down to Earth from outer space is something which could not be known by the science of the 7th century.
The giant body crashed into the center of the planet and gave Earth its iron core.
Sky's protection comes in at number 8. Now the sky plays a very important role in protecting the Earth. The sky protects the Earth from the lethal rays of the sun. If the sky did not exist, then the sun's radiation would have killed all life on Earth. So pretty much the sky acts like a blanket wrapped around the Earth to protect it from the freezing cold of space. Now the Quran asks people to consider and ponder upon the sky in the following verse. We made the sky a protective ceiling, and yet they are turning away from our signs. And you can find that in the Quran, Surah 21, verse is 32. Now the protective properties of the sky were discovered by scientific research conducted in the 20th century.
The sky protects the Earth from the lethal rays of the sun. If the sky did not exist, then the sun's radiation would have killed off all life on Earth.
Another surprising thing mentioned in the Quran at number 7 is the mountains. Now the Quran points our attention to a very important characteristic about mountains. And the verse goes as follows. Did we not make the earth a resting place and the mountains as stakes? And that passage, by the way, is taken from the Quran, Surah 78, verses 6 to 7. So the Quran indicates that mountains have deep roots by using the word stakes to describe them. Now, in fact, mountains do have deep roots, and the word stakes is a very accurate description for them. Now, there's a book entitled Earth by geophysicist Frank Press, and he explains that mountains are like stakes and are buried deep under the surface of the earth. Mount Everest, the height of which is approximately 9 kilometers above the ground, has a root deeper than 125 kilometers. Now the fact that mountains have deep stake-like roots was not known until after the development of the theory of plate tectonics in the beginning of the 20th century. Number 6 brings us the expansion of the universe. Now, at a time when science and astronomy was still primitive, the expansion of the universe was described actually in the Quran. And in the Quran, Surah 51, verse 47, it says, "And it is we who have built the universe with our creative power and keep expanding it." Now, the fact that the universe is expanding was discovered in the last century. Now, the physicist Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, writes, "The discovery that the universe is expanding was one of the great intellectual revolutions of the 20th century."
Astronomers think that the universe appears to be expanding at an accelerating rate.
Okay, so with that said, let's continue with this episode. At number 5, we have the sun's orbit. That's also mentioned in the Quran. So back in the year 1512 AD, the astronomer Nicholas Copernicus put forward his theory that the sun is motionless at the center of the solar system and that the planets revolve around it. Now, the belief that the sun is stationary was widespread amongst astronomers until the 20th century. It is now a well-established scientific fact that the sun is actually not stationary, but it's moving in an orbit around the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Now, the Quran actually mentions the orbit of the sun, and it goes as follows. It is he who created night and day, the sun and the moon, each floating in its orbit. And you can find that in Surah 21, verses 33.
It was Galileo Galilei who in 1612 observed sunspots moving across the sun's disk over time, therefore confirming the sun's rotation.
We have at number 4 an interesting mention of embryology. So check this out. This passage goes as follows. We created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him as a drop into a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaka. And that word, by the way, means leech, suspended thing, and blood clot. And then the passage continues as follows. Then we made the alaka into mudga, which is a chewed substance. And that is found in the Quran, Surah 23, verses 12 to 24. Now, Professor Emeritus Keith L. Moore, he's one of the world's most prominent scientists in the field of anatomy and embryology. He said this: "It's clear to me that these statements must have come to Muhammad from God, because almost all of this knowledge was not discovered until many centuries later." At number 3, we have the seas and oceans. Modern science has discovered that in the places where two different seas meet, there's actually a barrier between them. I found this really fascinating. Now, this barrier divides two seas so that each sea has its own temperature, salinity, as well as its density. And there's a pretty surprising passage in the Quran that goes as follows. He has set free the two seas meeting together. There is a barrier between them. They do not transgress. And that's in Surah 55, verses 19 to 20. Moving on now to number 2. We got 2 surprising things left to talk about. But number 2, we have skin pain receptors. For a long time, it was thought that the sense of feeling and pain was actually dependent on the brain. However, it's been discovered that there are pain receptors present in the skin. Without these pain receptors, a person would not even be able to feel pain anyways. Now, in the Quran, it says, "We shall send those who reject our revelations to the hellfire. When their skins have been burnt away, we shall replace them with new ones that they may continue to feel the pain. God is almighty, all-wise." And that's in Surah 4, verses 56. Now, in this episode, we've come to number 1, and we're going to be talking about lying and the frontal lobe. Now, there's actually a book titled Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology, which includes the results of research on the functions of this area, and it states, "The motivation and the foresight to plan and initiate movements occur in the anterior portion of the frontal lobes, the prefrontal area. The part of the brain that is responsible for movement is said to be seized if the man does not stop." Secondly, numerous studies have shown that the same region, the frontal lobe, is responsible for the lying function of the brain. There was, by the way, a very cruel and oppressive tribal leader known as Abu Jahl, who lived during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and in the verses of the Quran, they read as followed: "No, indeed, if he does not stop, we will seize him by his forehead, his lying, sinful forehead." And you can find that in the Quran 96, verses 15 to 16. So as you can see there, Muslims point out that the Quran does not call this person a liar, but calls his forehead, the frontal part of the brain, lying and sinful, and warns him to stop. Starting at number 10, we have hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen. Now, at high altitudes, the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere decreases. Now, when the oxygen level drops, the blood vessels in the lungs constrict. Hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, or HPV, is a physiological phenomenon in which small pulmonary arteries constrict in the presence of alveolar hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. Now, the blood vessels in the lungs, they constrict when the oxygen levels drop. So this was only known recently. However, Muslims believe that this was actually described in the Quran 1400 years ago before it was discovered by modern scientists. In the Quran, Surah 6, verses 125, it says, "So whoever Allah wants to guide, he expands his chest to contain Islam. And whoever he wants to misguide, he makes his chest tight and constricted as though they were climbing into the sky. Thus does Allah place defilement upon those who do not believe. And at number 9, we have gender. That's found in the Quran as well, how gender is produced. So the father determines the sex of a baby, right? And now the females have the XX chromosomes. And that is that they can only give one X chromosome. But since males have X and Y chromosomes, then men can either give X or Y chromosomes. This means that it is actually the males who determine the sex of a newborn baby by giving either an X or Y chromosomes. Now in the Quran, Surah 53 verses 45 to 46, it says, "And he, Allah, creates pairs, male and female, from sperm emitted." So the Quran states that it is the sperm that determines whether the baby is male or female. But since sperm only comes from the males, this means that it is males who determine the sex of the baby. And it's also very surprising to note that the verse number 46 is the same number of chromosomes that humans have. 23 pairs equal 46 total. Another surprising thing that Muslims highlight from the Quran is the full moon. To have a full moon, the sun, the earth, and the moon have to be aligned. So the full moon occurs at a precise moment in time. So it's the instant when the sun and the moon are aligned on opposite sides of the earth. Now the full moon is only visible from sunset to sunrise because Earth is of course a sphere, so it's impossible for people in the daytime to see the full moon. So they have to wait for the Earth to rotate so that they are facing the full moon. But you see, this was only recently discovered, and in the Quran, Surah 84 verses 16 to 18, it says, "I swear by the twilight and by the night and what covers it, and by the moon as it grows full." At number 7, the surprising thing found in the Quran is miscarriage. So the researchers have known that during times of stress, the brain releases several hormones, including this one called corticotropin. Now, they're releasing this hormone, which is known as CRH. Now, research suggests that CRH, as well as other stress hormones, may also be released everywhere in the body where it specifically targets localized mast cells. And during stress, the local release of CRH, they cause these mast cells to secrete substances that can cause miscarriages. And now in the Quran, Surah 22 verses 2, it says, "On the day you see it, every nursing mother will be distracted from that child she was nursing, and every pregnant woman will abort her pregnancy, and you will see the people appearing intoxicated while they are not intoxicated. But the punishment of Allah is severe." White hair comes in at number 6. Now, the big question is, can your hair turn white as a result of being totally shocked? Well, in theory, any sudden shock or accident or illness or change in metabolism could make your hair change color, but it won't be visible right away. Now, according to one doctor, Dr. John O'Connor, he's the head of the School of Physical Science and Mathematics at the University of Newcastle in Australia. He says, once your hair has grown out of its follicle, any emotional or physical trauma will not affect it. This hair is basically dead, like your nails. Yet severe adverse events could cause new hair that grows out a few weeks later to be white. And it's found in the Quran, Surah 73 verses 17, this passage. "So how will you, if you persist in unbelief, save yourself from a day which will turn the children white-haired?" At number 5, we have mass extinction. So this is a pretty loaded one. So dinosaurs, it's believed by most scientists that they got extinct when the massive meteor or asteroid hit the Earth. Now, on the impact, there's smoke and dust that covered the entire world. And now the comet itself didn't actually hit the dinosaurs, but rather it was the smoke and the dust that blocked the sunlight, which triggered a series of unfortunate, devastating events. Now, in a 3-page document written by Richard Cohen, University of California at Berkeley, the KT extinction in 1999, you'll find a detailed report and explanation talking about what happened after that impact. But it was just the smoke, not the dust, which caused the acid rain that killed the plants and the animals. Now, it's said that there are mountains in the heaven that have ice inside them. Those mountains could fall on Earth, making a very bright flash. And the following verse is found in the Quran, Surah 24 verses 43. "Can't you see that Allah makes the clouds move gently, then joins them together, then makes them into a pile? Then you see rain come out from within, and he sends down from heaven mountains with ice inside them that strike whoever he wishes or misses whoever he wishes. its flash almost blinds you. Now the chapter, the smoke in the Quran, is believed to describe the smoke that resulted. And you can see in the Quran, Surah 44 verses 9 to 10, it says, "So watch out for the day when the sky brings prevailing smoke, enveloping mankind. This is a painful torture." Another surprising thing in the Quran is the spider's web. So it's generally accepted that adult female spiders build the typical webs, while adult males do not build webs. They, however, reserve that for mating purposes. And in the Quran, you'll find this verse in Surah 29 verse 41. "The likeness of those who take to themselves protectors other than Allah is that of the spider. It builds a house, but the most fragile of houses is a spider's house." There's also a surprising mention about pairs in the Quran. Up until about 100 years ago, it was thought that only man and animals were made in pairs. Female animals, male animals. However, the Quran said that everything from which the land produces, humans and what they could not see, were also made in pairs. So today we know that all matter is actually in pairs. Matter and antimatter, electrons, positrons, all of that stuff. Now in the Quran, Surah 36 verses 36, it says, "Glory to him, Allah, who created in pairs all things that the land produces, and their own kind, humans, and other things that they have no knowledge of." The next surprising thing mentioned in the Quran at number 2 is antioxidants. The antioxidants found in pomegranates as well as dates, they help the heart from suffering from heart attacks. Now there is an Israeli study that showed that regular consumption of pomegranate juice and dates actually prevent this. Researchers at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology have found that half a glass of juice a day, along with 3 dates, can bring about a significant reduction of the accumulation of fatty cells in arteries, which can cause heart attacks and strokes. Now, according to a study published in the British scientific journal Food and Function, the scientists tested the effects of fruits on mice as well as on arterial cells that were grown in a laboratory. And they found that when used regularly, the combination of antioxidants contained within pomegranates and dates could actually lower cholesterol in the arteries by 28%. Now, Muslims have brought to light that it's found in the Quran in Surah 55 verses 68. It says, "In them are the fruits, the dates, palms, and pomegranates." And finally, the number one surprising thing in this episode mentioned in the Quran is the eye pupil. So random, but it's there. So lying usually involves some level of tension or anxiety, unless you're a very good liar, right? Because honestly, you might be so worried and concerned to some degree that you're going to be found out to be a liar. So this tension subconsciously triggers a sympathetic nervous system, which will cause certain effects throughout your body. Sympathetic stimulation to the eye will cause contraction of the radially oriented pupillary dilator muscle fibers in the iris and will result in mydriasis, which is dilation of the pupil. Now, an opposite effect is actually achieved when the eye receives parasympathetic stimulation, meaning when you're calmer and you're probably confessing the truth or something. The pupil actually undergoes what's called meiosis or constriction. Now in the Quran, it said in Surah 40 verse 19, "He knows the betrayal of the eyes." Coming up at number 10, we have anxiety. Now it says in the Quran that indeed mankind was created anxious. Now this has a lot of meaning that's put into it, and one of the most important meanings is that according to Muslims, Allah actually created humans for paradise but brought us to earth. And this means that humans are in an environment that is not actually normal for them. Therefore, humans go through a wide range of different emotions in this world. While there are positive emotions that humans feel, there are also emotions like anxiety as well as sadness that we experience. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. But coming up next at number 9, psychology. That's talked about in the Quran as well. Specifically in the Quran, Surah 5 verses 30, it says, "So the nafs or self of the other, latter one, encouraged him and made fair seeming to him the murder of his brother. He murdered him and became one of the losers." Now, the Quran describes what's called the nafs or the selves as operating out of one of 3 states. There's the nafs al-amara, which is the commanding self. Then there's the nafs al-alawama, which is the accusatory self. And then thirdly, there's the nafs al-mutmena. That is the peaceful self. Now, the Quran explains how these states actually command our psyche and tells us what to do. they control us, they dominate us, and now when our emotional needs are being poorly met, the nafs al-amara begins to control our feelings. But on top of that, the thoughts and the behaviors are also controlled by this as well. And the Quran provides guidance to learn and practice relaxation exercises to weaken the influence of the nafs or selves. So there we see in the Quran, there's psychology mentioned there. Hope is another surprising thing that is mentioned in the Quran, and the Quran recognizes various types of hope. Specifically it says, and they, the people of the book, said, none will enter paradise unless he be a Jew or a Christian. Those are their false hopes. And that's in the Quran, Surah 2, verses 111. Now, there's a term called omniyatun, and those are hopes that lack practical basis in reality and have very little chance of actually becoming real. Sort of like wishful thinking. Then there's wad, and that's a hope of attaining something which is motivated by the love of a certain thing or a person. Now, it can have a positive connotation or a negative connotation based on the circumstances and the context. Like, for example, in the Quran, Surah 15, verses 2, it says, perhaps those who disbelieve will wish that they had been Muslim. So that's speaking of a type of hope in a negative connotation. So I also thought that this was pretty fascinating because, you know, obviously hope is linked to religion, but hope being broken down into multiple types of hopes, I didn't expect to see that in the Quran, so that's what I included in this episode. Now, coming at number 7, we have affection and mercy, also stuff that are related to religion in general. But check this out. The Quran says this, and of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them. And he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who give thought. And that's in the Quran, Surah 30, verses 21. So in this verse, we see God regards the creation of spouses as a sign. And in order to find peace and harmony between two of them, the verses say God himself placed affection and mercy between them so that they can live a life of tranquility. Now, the relationship between the spouses is based on affection and mercy. Another surprising thing mentioned in the Quran is sex. So sex has been openly recommended in the Quran. As a matter of fact, Surah 2 verses 222 says this, when they, which is referring to the wives, have cleansed themselves after menstruation, you go into them as Allah has commanded. Now, one thing to point out though is that the phrase commanded, it actually doesn't refer to a legislative command or anything like that. And what I mean by that, it's like it doesn't mean that as soon as somebody's wife becomes clean when she's off her period, that you need to immediately go and lay with her. No. But rather, it's referring to the sexual urges inside of human nature. Quran says God put those there, and you gotta use the urges as intended. So yeah, I'll just end that point there in an effort to just make this video as appropriate as possible. Definitely don't want to offend anyone or have this video get flagged on YouTube. Continuing at number 5, we have parents. As for the children, who are the fruits of their parents' love, inside of Islam, it lays down a comprehensive moral structure that enjoins parental responsibility and the child's duty to their parents. The Quran specifically says, and treat your parents with kindness if one or both of them attain old age in your care. Never say to them a word suggesting disgust, nor reproach them, but address them with reverent speech. And humble yourself out of mercy before them and pray, my Lord, be merciful to them for having cared for me in my childhood. And you can find that in Surah 17, verses 23 onward. Also, do you know that equality is mentioned in the Quran? So yeah, one of the most misunderstood areas in Islam actually is the position of women in the religion. Now, the general perception in the West is that Muslim women are actually subjugated and almost seen as property to men. Now, while not all Muslims deal with women as inferior, this unfortunately is true in some parts of the Muslim world, and this treatment is supposedly justified by the religion. However, in the Quran itself, it states that men and women are equal. Period. In Surah 49 verses 13 it says, O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing, and acquainted. So in the Quran, there you go. Mankind is male, female, man, woman. Nobody's better, nobody's above anyone. Definitely men and women are different. We're made differently, but men don't own women, women don't own men. Number 3, we have the mention of patience. Now, patience is mentioned in the Quran in 90 places. Patience is made a condition of success and prosperity in the Quran. And specifically, the Quran says, "O you who believe, persevere and endure and remain stationed and fear Allah that you may be successful." And that's found in the Quran, Surah 3, verses 200. So yeah, it's definitely true. In every area of your life that you are successful in, there is a state of patience that you need to go through first. Number 2 is actually the mention of humanity. So check this. The Quran places a lot of emphasis on the oneness of human beings and introduces the idea of common human origin and ancestry at 4 different places. And it says that humans actually have their origin in a single cell or soul. Now, to quote from the Quran, it says, "O mankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single soul, created of like nature, the mate, and from them twain scattered like seeds, countless men and women. Reverence Allah through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you, for Allah ever watches over you." And you can find that in Surah 4, verses 1. So that also kind of ties into the mention of equality of men and women as well. But either way, the last surprising thing that I want to share in this episode that's mentioned in the Quran is forgiveness. Now, forgiveness teaches a person patience and makes a person better for it, as well as stronger and more steadfast in their goals because they don't care what life throws their way. Also, another interesting point is that forgiveness is an attribute that God uses the most generously found in the Quran. Now, it's mentioned in the Quran in a number of places. Specifically, one verse says, "And let not those of virtue among you and wealth swear not to give aid to their relatives and the needy and the immigrants for the cause of Allah, and let them pardon and overlook. Would you not like that Allah should forgive you? And Allah is forgiving and merciful." And that's found in the Quran, Surah 24, verses 22. I'll be highlighting 10 of some of the most misunderstood verses in the Quran according to Muslim sources. And number 10, we have Surah 2, verses 191. Now, this has a false interpretation, and that is, "Slay the unbeliever wherever you find them." Now, you see, reading the verses before and after actually gives some context, and that's not necessarily what the verse actually says. Either way, when we look at Surah 2, verses 190, it says, "Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors." And then moving on to Surah 2, verses 191, it actually says, "And kill them wherever you overtake them, and expel them from wherever they have expelled you. And fitna is worse than killing. And do not fight them at al-Masjid al-Haram until they fight you there. But if they fight you, then kill them. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers." And then moving on to Surah 2, verses 192, the next verse, it says, "And if they cease, then indeed Allah is forgiving and merciful." So those scriptures there just really give some context of the actual text. Now, moving on to number 9, Surah 3, verses 28. Here's the false interpretation of this one. "Muslims must not take infidels as friends." And by the way, infidels are unbelievers. Now, the Quran doesn't forbid Muslims from becoming friends with non-Muslims, but during wartime, it says that they should not join with the enemy. When we look in the Quran, we find this: "Let not believers take disbelievers as allies rather than believers. And whoever of you does that has nothing with Allah except when taking precaution against them in prudence. And Allah warns you of himself, and to Allah is the final destination." And that's the full verse of Surah 3, verses 28. Next up, let's look at Surah 3, verses 85. Here is the false interpretation for this one. "Any religion other than Islam is not acceptable. Therefore, Islam is not tolerant of any other religious group." Here's the thing, all religions usually say that their religion is the most correct or the most beneficial, so there's not necessarily anything wrong in and of itself with Islam making that same claim. However, in the Quran, you will find certain verses that actually esteem prophets in Judaism and in Christianity. So this does point to one aspect that Islam is tolerant in. Now, the Quran says this: Say we have believed in Allah and in what was revealed to us and what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the descendants, and in what was given to Moses and Jesus and to the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we are Muslims submitting to him. That is Surah 3 verses 84. The Quran also says this in Surah 2 verses 256, there shall be no compulsion in acceptance of the religion. The next misunderstood verse is Surah 8 verse 12. It goes as follows, remember thy Lord inspired the angels with the message. I am with you, give firmness to the believers. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. Smite ye above their necks and smite all their fingertips off. And now for context, this was a verse that was revealed around the time of the Battle of Badr. The pagans of Mecca, they traveled more than 200 miles to Medina with an army of over 1,000 men to kill Muslims who numbered around 300. By this verse though, Muslims are ordered to fight to defend themselves. Another verse in the same chapter, Surah 86 verses 61 says this, but if the enemy incline towards peace, you also incline towards peace, and trust in God, for he is one that hears and knows all things. And that is the proper context of that verse. The next misunderstood verse we're going to look at is Surah 9 verses 123, and this is how it goes. O you who believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near, and let them find in you hardness, and know that Allah is with those who guard against evil. Now, this verse, according to Muslim sources, is speaking about the hypocrites who were among the Muslims in the time of the Prophet. The unbelievers who are near you were in actuality non-Muslims posing as Muslims who sought to corrupt the believing Muslims from within, destroying them from the inside out. Now, this instruction was to fight them, and fight in this context is to resist the skepticism of these hypocrites. The next two verses actually point out that this is actually about hypocrites. And whenever a new chapter is revealed, some of the hypocrites ask the believers in jest, whose faith has increased because of this? As for those who believe, it will certainly increase their faith, and they are joyful over that. And that was taken from Surah 9 verses 124. Now halfway in at number 5, we have Surah 48 verses 29. And it goes as follows, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and those who are with him are severe against disbelievers, and merciful among themselves. Now the disbelievers in this verse refers to those who persecuted and attacked the Muslims. This is not a verse directing Muslims to just go out and mistreat other non-Muslims. Moving on to number 4, here we look at Surah 98 verses 6. Now this is the false interpretation. Anyone who doesn't call themselves Muslim is going to hell. But you see, the actual verse goes like this. Verily, those who disbelieve from among the people of the scripture and al-mushrikun will abide in the fire of hell. They are the worst of creatures. Now, according to Islam, Muslims, they're not allowed to say that any one person is going to go to hell just because they call themselves a Christian, a Jew, or they have a different religious label or no religious label. Each person's destination when it comes to the hereafter is only known by God. Now, moving on to number 3, here we have Surah 5 verses 101 to 102. Now, here is the false interpretation of this one. Do not question Islam. Well, the full verse reads like this. O ye who believed, ask not questions about things which, if made plain to you, may cause you trouble. But if you ask about things when the Quran is being revealed, they will be made plain to you. Allah will forgive those, for Allah is oft forgiving, most forbearing. Some people before you did ask such questions, and on that account lost their faith. Now, this is in reference to those people who ask useless questions about when a revelation is revealed from the Quran. And here's the thing, if all their questions were answered, well, it would have made the duties of their faith and practicing their religion a lot more specific, and therefore making it a lot more difficult to perform. Moving on to number 2, here we have Surah 8 verses 65, and this is a false interpretation. The unbelievers are stupid. Urge the Muslims to fight them. Now the correct reading of that verse is this: O Prophet, urge the believers to battle. If there are among you 20 who are steadfast, they will overcome 200. And if there are among you 100 who are steadfast, they will overcome 1,000 of those who have disbelieved, because they are people who do not understand. Now, Islam teaches that this verse was revealed to motivate the Muslim army, which was less in number than the opposition in the Battle of Badr. Now, we end this episode off with the most misunderstood verse of the Quran in this episode, and that is Surah 22 verses 19. Here is the false interpretation first. Punish the unbelievers with garments of fire, boiling water, melt their skin. But this is not describing an Islamic punishment to be administered, but rather it's a punishment that happens in hell. Here is the more correct translation of the verse, along with verses that say that this is the punishment in hell. When we look at Surah 22 verses 19, it says, these are two adversaries who have disputed over their Lord. But those who disbelieve will have cut out for them garments of fire. Poured upon their heads will be scalding water. Now, Surah 22 verses 22, it says, every time they want to get out of hellfire from anguish, they will be returned to it, and it will be said, taste the punishment of the burning fire. And then we have the following verse that contrasts what those who are granted paradise will experience. And just notice a similarity when it comes to the symbolism of being clothed with garments. And this verse that I'm referring to in Surah 22 verses 23 says, indeed, Allah will admit those who believe and do righteous deeds to gardens beneath which rivers flow. They will be adorned therein with bracelets of gold and pearl, and their garments therein will be silk.